Okay, you guys, welcome back to the living room. If you were here for the last deep dive, you know we talked about the jet engine, we talked about the computer, we talked about the microwave, but I couldn't stop digging. I literally could not sleep. I went back into the archives, I bought more books, I scoured the Imperial War Museum website, and I found 10 more things. And honestly, this second list might be even more shocking than the first one because these are the things that we see in movies every single year. These are the things that define the Hollywood version of World War II. I'm talking about spy gadgets. I'm talking about aiming systems. I'm talking about literally controlling the weather. So grab your tea and let's get into part two of the British inventions we totally took credit for. Number one, FIDO, the Fog Investigation Dispersal Operation. Let's start with the most British problem in human history, the weather. I have lived in the UK for 2 years, and I can confirm that the fog here is not like American fog. American fog is atmospheric, it's moody. British fog is a wall. It is a physical object that decides you are not going to work today. Now imagine it's 1943. You are the US Army Air Force or the RAF. You have thousands of bombers returning from Germany. They are running on fumes. They have wounded men on board. The landing gear is shot to pieces. They need to land right now. But the entire island of Great Britain has decided to wrap itself in a blanket of pea soup fog. Visibility is zero. In the US version of history, we usually assume we solved this with instrument landing systems or some high-tech radar approach, right? Because we love a gadget. But the British solution was so much more Mad Max than that. They didn't use a microchip, they used fire. The invention was called FIDO. It stands for Fog Investigation Dispersal Operation, and the concept is so simple, so dangerous, and so expensive that I genuinely didn't believe it was real until I saw the photos. The British engineers, led by a guy named Arthur Hartley, realized that if you can't see the runway because of the moisture in the air, you just need to boil the air. Literally, they built two massive pipelines running down both sides of the runway. They pumped thousands of gallons of petrol gasoline into these pipes, which were drilled with tiny holes, and when a bomber needed to land in the fog, they would just light it up. Two massive walls of flame, hundreds of feet long, would erupt on either side of the tarmac. The heat was so intense, we are talking about burning 100,000 gallons of fuel per hour, that it physically evaporated the fog droplets and created a clear tunnel of visibility right over the runway. Can you imagine being an American pilot in 1944? You've been flying for 10 hours, you're exhausted, you can't see the nose of your plane. The radio tower tells you to look for the runway, and suddenly you see the gates of hell opening up in the English countryside. Pilots described it as landing inside a volcano. It was turbulent, it was terrifying, and it was brilliant. The US military looked at this and said, wait, you're just burning the sky? Can we do that? We adopted the system, but the British were the ones who had the sheer audacity to propose it. It saved over 2,500 aircraft during the war. 10,000 airmen lived because British engineers decided to fight the weather with a flamethrower. That is an energy I did not know this country had. Number two, plastic explosives, Noble 808. Okay, let's pivot to something you have seen in every single action movie since the dawn of time. Plastic explosives. You know the scene? Tom Cruise or Matt Damon or whoever pulls out a brick of white putty. They mold it like Play-Doh. They stick a detonator in it. They walk away in slow motion. It screams modern American tactical gear, right? We associate C4 and plastique with the US military complex, but the grandfather of all plastic explosives, the stuff that made the sabotage war possible, that was British. It was called Nobel 808. Here is the context. Before Det Wee Wee, explosives were unstable. You had dynamite, which sweats nitroglycerin and can blow up if you look at it wrong. You had TNT, which is hard and requires a lot of prep. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, which is basically the real-life James Bond agency, needed something their spies could carry in a suitcase, mold into a train track, or hide inside a shoe. British chemists at the Woolwich Arsenal developed Nobel 808. It looked like green clay, it smelled like almonds, which is a terrifyingly specific detail, and it was completely stable. You could shoot it, you could set it on fire, you could drop it, it wouldn't explode unless you used a specific detonator. This was the game changer for the French resistance. The British airdropped tons of this stuff into Europe, and here is where the American movie myth really falls apart. You know the term plastique? We think of it as a generic cool spy word. It actually comes from the French resistance fighters, describing the British supplies explosif plastique. The US eventually developed C3 and C4 based on this research, perfecting the formula and making it white instead of green. But the tactical concept of moldable death was a British invention born out of desperation. And speaking of desperation, we have to talk about the limpet mine. This ties into the plastic explosive thing. I always thought the idea of a magnetic mine you stick to the hull of a ship was a fictional trope. It feels like something Batman would have. Nope, the limpet mine was invented by a British editor of a gardening magazine. I am not joking. His name was Stuart McCrae. He looked at how limpets, the little sea snails, stuck to rocks, and he designed a magnetic clamp with a time delay fuse. They loaded it with plastic explosives. There was a specific mission in 1943, Operation Jaywick, where a bunch of Allied commandos took a rickety fishing boat into Singapore harbour, paddled in on canoes, and stuck these British gardening magazine inventions onto Japanese ships. They sank 40,000 tons of shipping in one night. The high-tech spy gadget industry wasn't born in the Pentagon, it was born in the UK, often by people who just really liked gardening. Number 3. The gyro gun sight, the Mk2 K14. Let's go back up in the air for a second. If you play video games, Call of Duty, War Thunder, anything like that, you know about leading the target. If you are shooting at a plane that is moving, you don't aim at the plane. You aim where the plane is going to be. It's an incredibly difficult math problem to do in your head while you are pulling 4Gs and someone is trying to kill you. In the early part of the war, American and British pilots used fixed sights. It was basically a glowing red dot or a crosshair on a piece of glass. You had to guess the angle, you had to use Kentucky windage. It was an art, not a science. And then suddenly, in 1944, the P-51 Mustangs, the pride of America, started getting this new piece of kit called the K-14 aim sight. It was magic. You dialed in the wingspan of the enemy plane and the sight moved on its own. It used gyroscopes to calculate the turn, the speed, and the drop. It basically told you exactly where to shoot. It turned average pilots into aces overnight. If you read American memoirs, the pilots talk about this sight like it was a gift from God delivered by General Electric, but the K-14 was a direct copy, licensed and manufactured in the US of the Ferranti GGS gyro gun sight Mark II. The British had been working on this since 1939. The Farnborough Research Centre realised that planes were getting too fast for human aiming. They needed an analog computer in the cockpit. The engineering required to put delicate spinning gyroscopes into a vibrating, freezing, violent fighter plane cockpit is mind-boggling. When the British shared the Mark II with the US Army Air Forces, the Americans were skeptical. They thought it was too fragile, they thought it was too fussy. But then they saw the kill rates of the Spitfires using it. The moment the US adopted the gyro sight, our efficiency skyrocketed. We took the credit for the ace maker, but the math inside the box was British. It's another classic example of the US taking a British prototype, applying massive manufacturing power to it, and putting it in so many planes that everyone forgets where it came from. Number 4, the Sten gun versus the American quality myth. Okay, this one is less about a specific high-tech invention and more about a cultural invention, the disposable weapon. I grew up with the idea that American manufacturing was superior because it was quality. The Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun. It's iconic. It's made of machined steel and walnut wood. It looks like a piece of art. It cost the modern equivalent of about $2,500 to make back in 1942. It was beautiful. But you can't win a global war with beautiful. You win it with volume. After the retreat from Dunkirk, Britain had left almost all its weapons in France. They were defenseless. They needed machine guns, and they needed millions of them by next Tuesday. Enter the Sten gun. If you have seen a Sten gun in a museum, you probably laughed. It looks like a plumber assembled it out of spare parts in a garage. It looks like a muffler with a trigger. It's ugly. It has a metal skeleton stock that digs into your shoulder. It rattled. But here is the genius that Americans often overlook. It cost about $10 to make The British realized something that American procurement officers hated admitting: a gun doesn't need to last for 20 years. It needs to last for 20 minutes of intense combat. The Sten was the first true mass-production disposable weapon. It was made of stamped metal, not machined steel. You didn't need a gunsmith to make it, you needed a bicycle factory. The US eventually caught on to this philosophy with the grease gun, the M3, which looks a lot like a Sten, but we resisted it for so long. We were obsessed with the craftsmanship of the Thompson. The British taught us the brutal economic lesson of modern warfare. Quantity has a quality all its own. The Sten looks cheap, but it armed the entire French resistance, the Polish underground, and the British paratroopers. It was the invention of IKEA warfare. Ugly, functional, and available to everyone. Number 5, H2S radar. The TV in the cockpit. We talked about the magnetron in the last video, but we need to talk about what they actually did with it, because this specific application blows my mind. Ground mapping radar, codename H2S. Before 1943, bombing at night was a joke. You were flying in the dark, looking for a blacked out city in a blacked out country. The statistics are horrifying. Something like only 20% of bombs fell within 5 miles of the target. We were basically just throwing explosives into fields and hoping for the best. The Americans believed in daylight precision bombing with the Norden bomb sight. We thought we could fly during the day and hit a pickle barrel. The reality, we got slaughtered by German fighters, and when it was cloudy, which is always, we couldn't see anything either. The British scientists asked, what if the radar didn't look for planes? What if it looked at the ground? They realized that cities, lakes, and forests reflect radar waves differently. Buildings reflect a lot, water reflects almost nothing. Fields are somewhere in between. If you put a spinning radar dish on the belly of a bomber and hooked it up to a screen, a cathode ray tube, you could literally paint a map of the ground below you, through the clouds, through the smoke, through the dark. This was H2S. It was basically Google Earth in 1943. When the British turned this on, the war changed. The pathfinders could see the shape of Berlin or Hamburg on a glowing green screen. They didn't need to see the lights, they could see the bones of the city. There is a tragic side to this story that really highlights the stakes. The British were terrified of this technology falling into German hands. It contained the magnetron, the deepest secret of the war. But they had to use it. On one of the first missions, a Sterling bomber carrying H2S crashed in Rotterdam. The Germans found the device, they called it the Rotterdam Gerät. They were baffled. They looked at it and saw the magnetron and realized the British were generating power levels that German scientists thought were impossible. It didn't just help the Allies bomb better, it demoralized the German scientists because they realized how far behind they were in the physics game. The US bombers eventually got H2X units, built by Philco in the US, but we called it H2X or Mickey. If your grandfather was a navigator on a B-17 late in the war, looking at that glowing screen, he was looking at a British invention that turned the lights on in Europe. Number 6. Degassing. The magic trick. This one sounds like science fiction. It sounds like something from Star Trek. Captain, we need to degass the hull. Early in the war, the Germans had a nasty surprise, the magnetic mine. These weren't mines that you had to hit. They sat on the bottom of the ocean. When a big metal ship went over them, the ship's magnetic field triggered the mine. Boom, no contact needed. It was sinking ships, left and right. It was invisible. It was terrifying. The American response would likely have been to build minesweepers or try to blow them up. The British response was to ask a physics question. Can we make a 20,000-ton battleship invisible to magnetism? The answer was yes. The process was called degassing, named after the mathematician Gauss. The British figured out that if you wrapped a giant electrical coil around the entire ship, literally miles of copper wire running around the hull, and pumped electricity through it, you could create a magnetic field that exactly cancelled out the ship's natural magnetic field. You are basically cloaking the ship. It required incredibly precise measurements. There were teams of Wrens, Women's Royal Naval Service, who would work in these dangerous, muddy ranges to measure the magnetic signature of every ship. Then they would tell the captain exactly how much current to pump through the coils. If you got it right, the ship could sail right over the mine, and the mine wouldn't see it. When the US entered the war, our Navy was woefully unprepared for magnetic mines. We had to borrow this entire technology, the coils, the measurement ranges, the math, from the Royal Navy. It's one of those things that feels like magic. You are using electricity to hide steel from a magnet. And the scale of it. Every Liberty ship, every destroyer, every aircraft carrier that crossed the Atlantic had a degassing cable running around it. That was British physics saving American steel. Number 7, the Leigh light. Let's stay in the Battle of the Atlantic for a moment, because this is where the special relationship really mattered. The U-boats were winning. They were sinking supply ships faster than we could build them. The biggest problem was that planes could spot U-boats during the day, but at night, the U-boats would surface to recharge their batteries and travel fast. In the dark, they were invisible. A British RAF officer named Humphrey de Leigh had an idea. He wanted to put a massive searchlight on a plane. Everyone told him he was an idiot. They said the light would blind the pilot. They said the glare would reflect off the propeller. They said the U-boat would see the light coming from miles away and dive before the plane could attack. Leigh didn't listen. I'm sensing a theme here with British inventors: stubbornness. He developed a high-intensity carbon arc aimable searchlight. But the genius part was the tactic. The plane would use radar, British radar naturally, to find the U-boat in the pitch black. They would fly in silently. The U-boat crew would hear the drone of engines, but they wouldn't know where it was. Then, at the very last second, about a mile out, the pilot would flip the switch. A 22 million candle power beam would ignite the ocean. It was like the sun turning on. The U-boat was suddenly bathed in blinding white light. The gunners couldn't see to shoot back. The captain couldn't see to dive. And 3 seconds later, the depth charges were dropping. It was pure psychological terror. U-boat crews started calling them the damned lights. It turned the night, which used to be their safe zone, into a death trap. The US Navy adopted the Leigh light for our anti-submarine squadrons in the Pacific and the Atlantic. We often see movies of US Navy PBY Catalinas hunting subs, but that giant light under the wing? That's Humphrey Leigh's bad idea that won the Atlantic War. Number 8, GEE and OBOE. The granddad of GPS. If I drive anywhere in the UK, I use Google Maps. I am hopeless without it. I assumed radio navigation was a Cold War thing, or maybe something we developed for the B-29s. But the British built a GPS system in 1941. It was called GEE, and later the more precise version, OBO. Here is how it worked, and I promise I'll keep the math light. You set up radio towers in England, they send out pulses, your plane has a receiver. By measuring the time difference between the pulses from Tower A and Tower B, you can calculate exactly where you are on a grid. This wasn't just flying toward a radio beacon. This was hyperbolic navigation. It created an invisible grid over Europe. The RAF used this to guide bomber streams of 1,000 planes to a single point in the dark. But the most British part of this story is the electronic warfare that happened around it. The Germans eventually figured out GEE. They started jamming it. They would send out fake pulses to make the British planes fly off course. So the British invented OBO. OBO was so accurate that a plane flying at 30,000 feet could drop a bomb into a specific backyard in the Ruhr Valley. It was accurate to within yards. The Americans were stunned by this. When the US 8th Air Force started bombing, we relied heavily on British pathfinders using OBO to mark the targets for us. We had the big planes, we had the brave crews, but the eyes that guided us there were looking at a cathode ray tube designed by the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern. It's honestly humbling. We talk about American precision, but for a huge chunk of the war, our precision was borrowed from British radio waves. Number 9, the PIAT versus the bazooka. Okay, I have to include this one because it makes me laugh, and it perfectly illustrates the difference between American and British engineering. We all know the bazooka. It's American, it's a tube, it fires a rocket, whoosh, it looks cool. It was the first modern anti-tank weapon. The British equivalent was the PIAT, the projector, infantry, anti-tank. If the bazooka is a sleek rocket launcher, the PIT is a medieval torture device powered by a giant spring. I am not kidding. It didn't use a rocket motor, it was a spigot mortar. It had a massive steel spring inside. To cock it, you had to lie on your back and pull with your entire body weight. It was incredibly heavy. When you fired it, the spring slammed forward, ignited a charge in the tail of the bomb, and launched it. It had a recoil that could bruise your shoulder black and blue. It was notoriously difficult to reload. So why am I listing this as an innovation? Because unlike the bazooka, the PIAT had no backblast. When you fire a bazooka, a huge jet of flame shoots out the back. You can't fire it from inside a building or a bunker, or you'll roast your own team. The PIAT? You could fire it from a broom closet. You could fire it from a slit trench. It was silent-ish and smokeless. This made it the ultimate ambush weapon. British paratroopers at Arnhem used PIATs to destroy German Tiger tanks at close range. It was ugly, it was painful to use, and the troops hated lugging it around. But it worked in situations where the high-tech American bazooka would have been useless. It's the ultimate shed engineering solution. We don't have rocket motors? Fine. Do we have a really big spring? Excellent. Let's go kill some tanks. Number 10, tube alloys, the elephant in the room. And finally, we have to talk about the biggest one, the one that ends the war, the one that defines American superpower status. The atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project is the crown jewel of American scientific history. Los Alamos, Oppenheimer, the Trinity test. It is the American story. But the seed of that story, the proof that it was even possible, that was British. In 1940 and 1941, while the US was still debating whether an atomic bomb was science fiction, two scientists at the University of Birmingham, Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls, wrote the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum. They were the first people to calculate that you didn't need tons of uranium to make a bomb. You only needed a few kilograms of the isotope U-235. They laid out the blueprint for the weapon. The British set up a secret committee called the MARD Committee. They did the early research. They realized, oh my god, this is actually possible, and the Germans might be doing it. They codenamed the project Tube Alloys. When the British shared this data with the US in 1941, American scientists were skeptical. They thought the bomb was decades away. The British report convinced the US government to start the Manhattan Project. Winston Churchill and FDR signed the Quebec Agreement, which merged the projects. Britain sent their best scientists, the British mission, to Los Alamos. They worked side by side with Oppenheimer. But here is the kicker. After the war, the US passed the McMahon Act in 1946, which basically said, thanks for the help, but all this nuclear knowledge is now ours. We are cutting you off. Britain was locked out of its own discovery. They had to restart their own nuclear program from scratch to build the British bomb. It is the ultimate example of the dynamic I've been talking about. The theoretical spark, the initial eureka moment, happened here in the gloom of wartime Britain. The industrial scaling, the money, and the final execution happened in the vast deserts of America. So why am I obsessed with this? Is it because I hate America? Absolutely not. I love my country. I am proud of what we did. We built the ships. We flew the planes. We liberated a continent. But the American myth, the idea that we did it alone, that we arrived like aliens from the future to save the primitive Europeans, is not just wrong, it's boring. The truth is so much more human. The truth is that necessity is the mother of invention. The British invented these things not because they wanted to get rich or because they wanted to show off, but because they had a gun to their head. They invented Fido because they couldn't land. They invented the Leigh light because they were starving. They invented the Sten gun because they were defenseless. When I look at a microwave now, I don't just see a way to heat up my coffee. I see a copper block drilled by two guys in Birmingham who were afraid of the Luftwaffe. When I see a plane land in the fog, I see the ghost of Arthur Hartley burning gasoline on a runway. History is a team sport, and living here has taught me that while America might have been the MVP of the second half, we owe a hell of a lot of assists to the team that played the first half alone. So to my British friends, thank you for the radar, the jets, and the plastic explosives. And to my American friends, you're welcome for the history lesson. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go microwave some tea, which I know is a crime here, but hey, at least I know who invented the machine. See you in the next one.